Hi, everyone. I'm Rory Lindsay, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the fifth event in our series, Buddhism and Posthumanism. So today we're joined by Dekila Chungyalpa of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whose talk is titled Mother Wisdom, Learning to Embody Interdependence in the Anthropocene. And we actually have one extra event this year that's finally been scheduled. So we're going to have a roundtable discussion involving all the speakers, and that will be on May 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And you'll get a notification about that. It'll be the same link, but that'll be really exciting to have everyone come together and just talk for a while about what we've discussed this year. Before we begin, I'm just going to hand over the mic to the director of the host center, Sungjung Kim.
Well, thank you, Rory, and greetings to everyone. I'm really delighted to be here at the last lecture sponsored by and organized by the Host Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Toronto. My name is Sungjung Kim. I'm the director of the Host Center, relatively new, and so for many of you who are unfamiliar with me, I am an art historian and archaeologist at University of Toronto at the Department of Art History, specializing in the ancient Mediterranean world as well as Gandhara and South Asian Buddhist art. The Buddhism and Posthuman series that launched in the fall of 2021, organized by professors Rory Lindsay and Francis Garrett, examines the place of humans in our world and how humans relate to other animals and the consequences of anthropocentric attitudes. It looks to explore how Buddhist traditions understand relationships between humans and non-humans, and how those traditions might confront destructive human behaviors connected with animals and with climate change. So by putting our own perspective in the context of the globalized world and situating ourselves vis-a-vis the diverse web of nature that this world represents, the series really profoundly resonates with the Host Center's mission to rethink Buddhism as a discipline in our religiously plural environment. And it connects with social, ethical, and philosophical issues of our contemporary society. So as many of you who know who have participated in the series, we've had a wonderful array of distinguished speakers and lecturers over the past 2 semesters, and we look very much forward to our final lecture. But before I do that, before I get Rory back on stage to introduce our speaker, let's start with the land acknowledgement. The University of Toronto operates on land that for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. And with that, I'll hand it over back to Rory.
Thank you so much, Sungjung. Right, so before I introduce our speaker today, Dekila, I just wanted to say a couple things about the meeting today. So our session today is being recorded, but not your names or the chat. We will edit the recording, ultimately kind of clean up the beginning and end, and post it on our YouTube channel and our website. And the session is also being live streamed on YouTube right now for those who can't use Zoom to join us. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end, and for that you can just unmute yourself once I say it's time for you to ask your question. I'll moderate, and just ask your question that way, and we'll have a discussion. And of course, just please keep yourself muted in the meantime, just to minimize background noise. And finally, you're welcome to post comments in the chat as we go. So now finally I can introduce Dekila. So Dekila Chungyalpa is the director of the Loka Initiative, which is an environment and climate education outreach platform for faith leaders, which is based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the mission of the Loka Initiative is to support faith-led environmental and climate action efforts locally and around the world, actually. It has a very broad scope, which is so wonderful. Prior to this, Dekila was awarded the prestigious McCluskey Fellowship at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, where she researched, lectured, and led fieldwork with graduate students. And from 2009 to 2014, Dekila founded and operated the World Wildlife Fund's Sacred Earth Program, which is building partnerships with faith leaders and religious institutions towards conservation efforts in the Amazon, East Africa, Eastern Himalayas, Mekong, and the US. She was the WWF US Director for the Greater Mekong Program from 2005 to 2009, and worked for the WWF in the Eastern Himalayas for 5 years before that. And so obviously Dekila has achieved just so much already, and we're so grateful for her efforts. They're just so essential and so important. And say just a few more things about Dekila and her achievements. So she's originally from Sikkim and speaks a really impressive array of languages. So she speaks Sikkimese, Tibetan, Hindi, Nepali, and English. And she also helped establish Koryuk in 2008, which is an eco-monastic association under the auspices of His Holiness the 17th Karmapa Urgyen Trinley Dorje, which coordinates over 50 monasteries and nunneries in the Himalayas that are themselves carrying out reforestation, climate preparedness, disaster management, and freshwater conservation projects. So that's really such an amazing project that is ongoing. And Dekila is the author of multiple papers, and I really encourage you to read everything she's written. There's a chapter in a book that came out recently, Ecology, Ethics, and Interdependence, the Dalai Lama in conversation with leading thinkers on climate change. That was with Wisdom Publications. I remember when that book came out, and it's just such a wonderful book. Another one is Generation Y, Spirituality and Social Change. And then finally, there's an article that she shared with us titled, At the Center of All Things is Interdependence. And it's a short and really powerful piece. If you haven't had a chance to read that, please do so. It's available through our website and through the link you received for this talk. So I think with that, I am going to hand things over to our speaker. Let me just replace spotlights. And I think we're ready to go. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rory. That was it can be excruciating to sit through your own introduction sometimes, you know. It's like, but I appreciate it so much. I want to thank you and Francis and Seungjun. I think this is such an incredible series of dialogue. I managed to sit through a few of them, and it's been really just, I found them so profoundly thought-provoking, and I think really necessary for what Buddhism needs to be grappling with right now. People don't always like to hear this, but Buddhism is the Johnny-come-lately into the environmental and climate scene. So I think anything that encourages this dialogue is just brilliant. I am going to start, I'm going to give my presentation with a PowerPoint, but before I do, let me just say, everybody, I'm so happy to be in this conversation with all of you. I hope this just gets to be really interactive, and I hope you have a lot of questions and we can just have a dialogue. So I need someone to, I think, allow me to share the screen, Rory. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Hey there.
Yeah, I figured it out.
You got it? Okay, good.
Yes.
Awesome.
So the topic that the title I came up with was Mother Wisdom, learning to embody interdependence in the Anthropocene. And at this point, I'm so used to being in academia that I realize I don't always explain what any of these things mean. So if at any point you have a question, just put it in chat and I'll try to explain it. I think the one thing that I do want to emphasize is what we mean by the Anthropocene. It's a very recent term we've started using. it wasn't created to be pejorative, but that's kind of what it's ended up meaning, which is basically an era in geological time where human beings are dominating the earth. And we immediately apply our own emotions to that actually pretty objective term. And so when we talk about the Anthropocene, most people tend to think of it in very negative ways. It's sort of, humans gone amok, humans that might be a pest on the planet, a world that is unsustainable, a world on fire. So there's a lot of negative imagery that goes with this term. And I've started realizing that thinking about it in that way doesn't really help us very much. It actually makes us freeze quite a bit. So a lot of my presentation is exploring how we kind of dissolve this tension around the future that we imagine and the present that we're in today. So I am right now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm on the traditional lands of the Ho-Chunk people. I like to show the lakes because the name that the Ho-Chunk people gave to the land I'm on right now is called Daejok. And that actually refers to the 4 sacred lakes that the university itself is on. And one of the reasons why I like talking about it is because it reminds me of my homeland, which is Sikkim. The previous speaker is actually Cousin Dorji Bhutia, whom some of you might have seen. We're from the same place. We're both from Sikkim, and we're actually childhood friends, which is a different story. But this is the land where I come from. Our lakes are really sacred and precious to us. And one of the things, about being from this region is that nature is alive to us. We kind of imbue the land with personality. Our lakes, so for example, this is the famous Sanggu Lake, which is supposed to have turned red right before India took over Sikkim as a warning to the people. And so all of nature have stories and personalities that are embedded in it for our people. We share the space with several incredible species. This is the red panda, known as, we call it Thongchung, which is small bear. It's actually genetically not a bear. It's closer to a raccoon. And you can find it in the broadleaf coniferous forests of Sikkim in particular. Another species is Thom, so this is an Asiatic black bear. This is the Himalayan black bear. And again, really incredible. You can see it all over the Kanchenjunga Wildlife Preserve. It's something that through the history of our peoples, we have actually lived in harmony with most of these species that I'm showing. This is the blue sheep. You can see it mostly in very high altitude areas. So Sikkim is a very small place. It's the size of Rhode Island, but because it changes so quickly in topography, we see a huge variety of biodiversity. We have over 5,000 plant species alone. All of this is to say that for those of us who are raised traditionally, so for example, my people, the Bhutia, we were raised in a way where we were taught that we lived in interdependence with other species and with the land. There wasn't this sense that everything that existed around us existed for us alone. There was this idea and a very strong ethic that we shared the land with other living beings. I spent so much of my time in wilderness areas as a child. This is a moment to stop and say that my mother took her vows and became a Tibetan Buddhist nun in her late 30s, as did my grandmother. And it's very common in Sikkim that elder women do this. And so I spent so much time traveling with my mother. I ended up growing up in a lot of wilderness areas and found that I had this deep love and reverence for wildlife in particular. So no surprise, oops, I'm sorry. I think I just jumped a slide. Let me see if I can go back. No surprise, I ended up working for the World Wildlife Fund. So I went into environmental science. I kind of knew I always wanted to work in wildlife conservation. And this is actually a photo that is one of the highlights of my career. I was the youngest conservation director for field programs at WWF. This is, I think, taken, I want to say in 2005 or 2006. And, as an Asian, tribal, Himalayan woman, I had sort of broken this barrier that existed, an invisible barrier that exists for women of color, particularly Indigenous women, where you're allowed to be an expert in the land you're from, but you're not allowed to be an expert of anything else. And I'd broken this barrier and gone to work in the Greater Mekong region in Southeast Asia. And I often say, one would think that I would have been on top of the world. I was really successful in the terms that were given to us, right? In what we think success is. You make decent money, you love what you do, you are either in the middle or the higher tier of the hierarchy you happen to belong in. And actually, I was experiencing deep anxiety and distress at this time. There wasn't a term that existed at this point to tell me what I was experiencing. We now know what it's called, which is eco-anxiety and climate distress. What I was experiencing was actually something that most of my colleagues were experiencing. We spent day in, day out in these habitats trying to protect it, trying to protect the species and the local communities we worked with. And yet we spent all our time imagining and forecasting a future that was completely unlivable. And that does something to you at a very deep emotional level, right? So you start absorbing that anxiety, and before you know it, you have it all the time. I think of myself as one of the lucky ones because I had this happenstance meeting with His Holiness the Karmapa in 2007. And he asked me to create environmental guidelines for the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and nunneries that were part of the Karma Kagyu system, or the Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. And I, of course, said yes. I like to joke, I thought it would make me a better Buddhist. I thought, I instantly thought, oh, okay, that takes care of my future lifetime. I'll say yes. I imagined it would be 2 weeks of my time. I would, give up my annual vacation and go work with the monks and nuns and create these guidelines and then go back to my real job, right? And what ended up happening actually was that those guidelines ended up creating such a strong ripple effect in the Tibetan monastic community. The monks and nuns came back and started asking for much more stringent training, training that actually helped them come up with projects that they could take on to address environmental and climate issues. So you're looking at one of the trainings here, and what you're seeing is that all of these people, all of these names represent a different monastery, and they're actually picking which issue they care about the most. So what you could see was that the monastic representatives were actually starting to identify the problems they were facing in that community, or the local community was facing, and what they would do, what they wanted to do as a response. Before you knew it, Koryug was born. So this association of Tibetan monastic monasteries and nunneries, self-created, self-designed, just came to be in 2009 after a series of trainings. And they've gone on to do incredible stuff. So you're looking, for example, right now at replantation. So these are the plantations of indigenous saplings. This is in the, I want to say the Tangutara Abbey area in central Nepal. We had monasteries that focused on wildlife protection and wanted to make that part of their messaging in all of their rituals. A lot of the monasteries would come together and do activities together. So this is after the Bagmati River flood, where all the monks and nuns came together to actually do the cleanup. You had several of the monasteries want to focus on food in particular, especially when they were thinking about the impact of climate change and what that meant in terms of food insecurity, water insecurity, resource depletion, and so on. And so the response was, we have so many flower gardens, why don't we turn that into actually food, basically growing food for our own monasteries and nunneries. One of the things that was really interesting to me was how many of the monasteries wanted to come together to do cleanups. They felt that, and this was a decision they came up with, where they felt that it would be better to teach by demonstrating than to, sit on the brocade throne and tell all the community that they needed to clean up. And so they decided to come together, and every second Saturday, they still do this. They go out into the community, they pick a part of the community, and then they do cleanup. And this has generated so much debate in the Himalayan communities because it's so shocking for local people. to see a monk or a nun actually pick up a broom and do something that we think belongs to the lower caste. So it's opened up this whole debate that brings us into almost like an intersectional analysis of who should be cleaning and who is responsible for their environment. His Holiness asked in 2015 that we start focusing on disaster management in particular because of climate impacts that we expect in the Himalayas. And so since then, we have been doing very dedicated training on disaster preparedness. At this point, we have over 400 monks and nuns who are trained as disaster management experts, who are first aid experts, who are first responders, who can take their robe and twist it and turn it into a stretcher in 5 minutes. It's something that the monasteries and nunneries have really responded to. Now, you might wonder how I could do all of this while I was still doing my job. And so in 2009, when I realized this was going to be a movement, I actually went back to WWF and said, went back to WWF and said that we have forgotten a really important stakeholder. I needed to convince them to let me do this work. And so these are the very transactional reasons I came up with, right? 85% of people follow a faith. 80% of biodiversity is in indigenous managed lands. Faiths collectively own 8% of total habitable land. 50% of schools worldwide are run by faiths. In fact, the question should have been all along, how come we in the environmental and climate movement haven't reached out to these really important stakeholder groups? And so they allowed me to create a program called Sacred Earth. And that was a pilot program where I took 5 years and worked in 5 different parts of the globe, trying to prove that when you work with faith leaders, you actually can move the needle on specific conservation and climate issues. And so this is actually what you're looking at is 50 different leaders from 50 different religious institutions all across Africa coming together to make a commitment against wildlife poaching and wildlife trafficking in Nairobi National Park. And the mound that you're looking at is basically ivory tusks that have been burned by the Kenya Wildlife Service. That led us to, I feel like I'm jumping around my slides, I apologize. That led us to also work in the Mekong region, where we were able to then work with the senior most Thai monks, male and female monks, asking that they actually ban the trade of ivory. Now, Thailand really mattered a lot to us at that time because even though most of the ivory ends up in China, and China is the actual source, right? That's actually the sink. That's where all the demand is coming from for ivory. Thailand is the way it gets to China. Thailand has a legal domestic ivory market. So all this illegal ivory would get poached and trafficked to Thailand. Thailand would label it as domestic and legal, and then it would go to China. And so what we were trying to do was close the loophole. And this was incredibly successful. And Thailand actually ended up making a commitment to close their legal market and are in the process of doing it since then. Now, when I finished working with WWF and ended up finishing the 5-year project that I had been leading, I was very kindly invited to Yale by Mary Evelyn and John Grimm. Some of you might know them, Mary Evelyn Tucker, who is probably one of the leading academics in faith and ecology. I can hear some backfeed, so I would request that person to just mute themselves. Thank you. And so in the process of being at Yale and having time to think through what I'd learned in the last 5 years of doing this faith-based work, I decided that the program that we really needed was something that built capacity for faith leaders and indigenous leaders around the world to work on environmental and climate issues, but it couldn't have an agenda of its own. And that this organization needed to be one that was one of service. It couldn't be one where we walked in and said, well, the issue we care about the most is, a free flowing river, or the issue we care about the most is climate policy, so we need you to work with us on this. Instead, the way I designed the Loka Initiative, it was that it's a program of service. for faith leaders and indigenous leaders who already know what they want to do on environmental and climate issues and are looking for capacity help and looking for resources to get them to a practical sort of, get them that practical know-how they need to lead their work. And so this is how the mission of the Loka Initiative was created. It's a wonderful place to have landed. My program is hosted by the Center for Healthy Minds, which is led by Richie Davidson, whom many of you might know. And it's a program that's across campus. We have 7 different institutions across campus that are part of the Loka Initiative, which means that I can tap into different professors and resources and capacity as I need, and as the faith leaders ask us, as they ask us for. We have basically 3 activity streams right now. The first is what I think of as the main work. This is the close hand-holding, capacity building we do in partnerships. In the last 3 years, we've focused on evangelical church leaders all around the world, including the US, on climate change, indigenous and native leaders from Wisconsin in particular, and then of course the Tibetan Buddhist monastics that I showed. And in each of these cases, what we do is we spend a lot of time building programs with them. There's a very deep dialogue that happens behind closed doors about what they need. With the evangelical church leaders, we have invested in a series of conversations with church leaders around the world on how they take on climate change and how they develop their own storytelling skills and their media skills to address climate change in particular. And then with the indigenous and native leaders, we ended up having this very powerful event last year called Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Earth, where we had over 1,000 people registered, 25% of whom were indigenous from around the world. And the dialogue was very much around indigenous resilience in particular. And this idea that when we talk about living in harmony with the land, and when we talk about the human and earth connectivity, what does that actually look like? And for them, the language that they picked and the lens that they picked was sustenance. So it sort of completely did away with our ideas of how we break down environmental issues, right? Freshwater, marine, or biodiversity, or climate. It was just like, no, none of that. We're going to look at this from the lens of sustenance. In terms of the academic and resource development, we have a brand new course we're launching this summer that looks at eco-anxiety, climate distress, and solastalgia, and provides students with basically an introduction to a really wide variety of contemplative methods that they can use to address these issues. It's one of a kind and something that we're launching for the first time. Now, people often ask me, it's great that you talk to faith leaders, but what does that mean in practical terms? Do they really walk the walk, right? And so the example I like to give is actually that of the fossil fuel divestment. We know when it comes to climate change that we're out of time. We need to be off this addiction that we have to fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And yet, any of the institutions you have a relationship with, whether it's the banks you go to, the superstores you go to, our employers, I can almost guarantee that most of us are actually helping support and building more investment into fossil fuels. And so among the divestment group, actually what's incredible is 1/3 of them are actually faith leaders. And so we're talking about trillions of dollars that they have, trillions of thousands of dollars that they've actually pulled out of the fossil fuel movement and reinvested into renewable energy. And they are actually leading the way when we talk about what a carbon neutral future needs to look like. There is, however, a much deeper reason why I work with faith leaders. And I think a lot of that has to do with the philosophy and the ethos that our faith traditions have, right? Faith traditions are constantly looking for a deeper meaning around human existence. And it goes far beyond just the accumulation of things that we have, the idea of success that I talked about earlier. We have a much deeper idea. It doesn't matter what faith tradition that we have a much deeper investment and idea of what human success looks like, what development looks like, right? And it often goes, of course, into the spiritual world. And that is really, really important to us because for so much of the time, we've created this worldview that really begins and ends from the moment we're born to the moment we die, with no sense that we might be part of a longitudinal geological time, or that we might be part of a series of rebirths, or that we might be part even generationally of what happens to us as a community. And so for me, the deeper reason why I engage with faith leaders is to have this dialogue, is to kind of bring back this conversation into the public sphere, especially in the environmental and climate movement. This is one of my favorite quotes ever, because if you're a Buddhist, this quote actually is funny. And if you're not a Buddhist, it's probably a little agitating. So Suzuki Roshi, I think the actual full line goes, you know, life is getting on a boat, going to the middle of an ocean, and then the boat sinks. And I think this is a really good reminder of why we need to care about other species and why we need to care about the planet, because we're here for such a short period of time, right? And how do we then, when we imagine impermanence, decide what the role of humans need to be, right, in that time frame? What you're looking at on the right side is this is called a bug out bag. Some of you might be familiar with. This is sort of your emergency pack that you build when you need to run into a disaster area, or you're running away from a disaster, or you're in a combat situation, right? And so for those of us who work in climate or disaster preparedness, this is something that we teach. This is something that we tell people they need to think about. What is in your bug out bag? What are the things you take in it, you put in it, and then you take away, right? And while I was doing a lot of climate disaster training, I found that one of the ways I would deal with my eco-anxiety was to come home and recreate my bug out bag. I would just sort of unpack everything, make sure that everything is still, nothing has expired, put it all back in. And in those days, my husband and I were living in California. And then lo and behold, there was an earthquake. And I couldn't lift my bug out bag. I had made it so heavy. I had actually made this bag so heavy, so full of all my attachments and my desires and my fears that it was literally unusable, right? And it ended up being such an incredible life lesson for me, because it forced me to think through what it is we actually need to survive. What is it that when we think the boat is going to sink, what is it that we need to break through all our instincts, right, of self-protection? What is it that we actually need to invest in? And that, of course, comes down to relationships. It's actually the relationships that will sustain us through any kind of disaster. And so I found myself then having to retreat into, you know, everything I mentioned to you, that spiritual space, that internal space, that space that is sort of the most sacrosanct. And for me, that really is my tradition, my own religion, right? And so, as I mentioned, you know, I'm the daughter and the granddaughter of Tibetan Buddhist nuns. So I was raised in a very, what you could almost say is an extinct way, you know, in a very traditional Bhutia Buddhist way. I had to memorize tons of prayers, among which was Sherab Ningpo, who some of you might know. It's called the Heart Sutra. And this prayer in particular is absolutely beautiful for many reasons. For the feminists out there, it's really beautiful because it calls out, you know, in the prayer, it's basically Chenrezig Avalokiteshvara in conversation with Shariputra, right? And so they are talking about sort of condensing the teaching of emptiness, and that itself is the prayer. But there is this moment where Shariputra asks Chenrezig, and he says, you know, what do the sons and daughters, right? What is the sons and the daughters need to know if they want to practice transcendental wisdom? And so this emphasis on daughters, to me, it's quite rare. And so for the feminists out there is one reason why it's so beautiful. This prayer is so beautiful. But there's also a much deeper reason, because it really comes to the heart of Buddhist teaching and is at the heart of everything I've done in my career, which is that it really focuses on non-dualism. It doesn't emphasize one, you know, the male versus the female. It doesn't emphasize wisdom over compassion. It really brings the energies of all of these things together. And so whenever I think about how do we get over this climate crisis, how do we overcome the challenges that we as a species are facing, that we have caused such untold suffering on other species in the last 400 years. How do we break down that karmic debt that we have, right? How do we come to terms with the Anthropocene? I always come back to this teaching. The image that you're looking at is Prajnaparamita, and she's the mother of all Buddhas. She represents this emptiness that we're talking about, this wisdom, mother wisdom. Now, in this prayer, in Sherab Nyingpo, generally ends up, going through all of these reasons why emptiness is form and form is emptiness. And I am not a Dharma teacher, so that's all I'm going to say about that. Please find a Dharma teacher for those of you who find this interesting. But there is this point where he actually breaks everything down when he talks about what identity is, right? And it basically is an examination of us as individuals, or anything as an entity, as an independent entity. And what you find is that it rests on something else, that none of us can exist by ourselves. Even in this moment, the oxygen, that's entering my mouth right now and my nose, right? My nostrils, it comes from elsewhere. It comes from, plankton from the ocean and plants right outside my window. If it just I couldn't survive even 4 minutes without that oxygen. And so this idea that I, as Dekila Chungyalpa, exist makes no sense whatsoever. And I think fundamentally, that gives us so much freedom. This concept gives us so much freedom to actually embrace other species, to embrace non-centering humans in this dialogue, in the Anthropocene, to observe the Anthropocene as something that isn't frightening, but is an opportunity. It could be a do-over. And I think that's where the power of Prajnaparamita lies. When we embrace this idea of emptiness of self, what do we find? Well, we find everything else, don't we? we find magnitude, we find relationships, we find community. And those are all the things that we need when we want to embrace the Anthropocene as an opportunity for us to actually save the earth. Now, as a Dharma practitioner and as the daughter and granddaughter of Buddhist nuns, there is this entire wisdom tradition that I've been handed and that I constantly turn to, right? But then also, as a trained environmental scientist, there is all this wisdom that's handed from nature that I also turn to. And so for me, what's fascinating is how these two traditions actually mirror each other so closely, that actually you can see the evidence of one of the wisdoms in the other, and it goes both ways. And so one of the things that I love to point out is that the earth is a closed system. So what does that mean? So that basically means the earth is made up of the atmosphere, right? Like the lovely blue hue that you can see around this marble, right? All the air that you can think of. The lithosphere, which is basically the turf, right? That kind of what you have, the terrain, the land, and so on. And then the hydrosphere, which is the blue, which is the water, right? So if you imagine this as a marble in space, the thing is, besides energy, nothing really enters or leaves it. There's an occasional meteor, and that's about it. Nothing materially leaves this globe and comes inside, which means that everything that happens, the people we hate, the people we love, the politics, the wars, the environmental devastation, all of that is happening in a closed system. We are literally dependent on each other. And we are recycling into each other all the time, right? Because we're born, we live, we die. And then we are subsumed into humus and we become part of something else. Literally, we're exchanging all the time within this closed system. The other thing that I think is just incredible is that inside the earth, however, everything is an open system, right? Everything is inputting and outputting into each other. There is no real boundary. We as humans, we've carved up the terrain and said, this is this country and this is that country. But actually, you look at anything, look at rain, look at how it's created, cloud formation from everywhere, right? You can't control that. You can't say that clouds can only appear over a certain country, right? And then how it falls with such compassion, right? Everywhere, anywhere. Again, cannot control that. And then how it enters rivers, where it goes. It's so hard to control rivers. We all know this, and then how it ends up in the ocean. So just looking even at one of the systems, ecological systems, tells us that actually inside the earth, everything flows into each other. And then coming back to interdependence, everything rests on something else. Everything is in some kind of relationship with each other. There is no species, no entity on the planet that doesn't have a relationship with another species, another entity. Flowers cannot bloom without bees. Humans cannot have agriculture without bees. 1/3 of our agriculture would die if bees disappeared tomorrow, right? We're all dependent on each other. And so this brings me back again to this incredible wisdom of Prajnaparamita, right? When we talk about mother wisdom, what are we saying? We're all interdependent. The self actually is irrelevant. It's just part of a much larger self. And so going back to this concept of the Anthropocene and it being something terrible, actually what I see again and again, especially with the way faiths have come to work with climate and environmental movements, is that what we actually have is an opportunity. We have this moment where we can shift the paradigm that we're in, the socioeconomic paradigm we're in of neoliberalism, right? Where everything is for sale. Everything is a pyramid, everything is a hierarchy, to actually this understanding that we're a part of this much larger flow. We are part of the system. Now, I kind of glossed over, I felt, the Sikkim part because I wanted to keep this at the end. So for those of you who know Sikkim, you would recognize this. This is Mountain Kanchenjunga. For those of you who don't know the Himalayas, you probably have never heard of this mountain. It's the 3rd tallest peak on the planet. And so take a moment, because if you've never heard of it, it will come as a surprise to you, right? This is the 3rd tallest peak. How come no one knows about it? Well, that's because Kanchenjunga is alive to us, the Bhutia, the Lepcha, and the Song and Nimbu people of Sikkim. We don't allow him to be climbed. He is our protective deity. We have fought off countless of lucrative deals, private sector, central government, all kinds of mountaineering outfitters coming in, trying to convince us that we should let him be climbed. But because he's alive to us, because nature is alive to us, has its own identity, has its own rights, we have protected him all this while because he protects us. And I say this because I think when we think about how we embody interdependence, it has to go beyond what we do in our meditation, on our meditation mats and in our prayer rooms. It really has to go out into the world, and it has to begin with protecting nature, because nature is the only reason why we're breathing right now, right? There is a self-serving reason, and then there is a reason of gratitude and reciprocity. And so there is a path forward, very much so. I think for us to actually make the Anthropocene something where all species can thrive, right? Where all living beings can live in harmony. But it requires that we embody it. And it requires that we grasp this future with courage, not just sort of sit around waiting for someone else to lead, but that we self-anoint ourselves as leaders and come forward. Thank you so much. Sujichi.
Thank you so much. Oh yes, perfect. Wow, that was so powerful and so eloquent. Thank you so much. So yes, we're going to move into questions. I mean, I might start with one question, and then we'll go from there. I'm curious to hear from you. In terms of the efforts, that you've been pursuing for so long and continue to pursue. What role has the consumption of meat, the killing of animals, the importance of a vegetarian diet vis-a-vis, not just ethical concerns, but environmental concerns, which of course are so closely tied. I'm curious how that fits into your initiatives. And I mean, this is certainly, sadly, a bit of a blind spot for many communities, including Tibetan Buddhist communities. So yeah, I'm curious if you could start with that. Yeah.
So I'm happy to. So when I talked about this this meeting I had with His Holiness in 2007, I jumped over why I was there, and it's because my family is of the Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. So we have this very big ceremony in Bodh Gaya every year called the Kagyu Manlam. And I happened to be, well, I was dragged by my family there, is more truthful. And I was sitting in the audience with tens of thousands of people. And His Holiness the Karmapa was giving a teaching on compassion. And suddenly he started to say how he had become a vegetarian. Excuse me, sorry. So he ended up saying how he had become a vegetarian because he had started to realize that he reeled off, and many of you will know this prayer, but it's the prayer that we do, the Bodhicitta prayer. He was reeling it off all the time, but never thinking about the fact that his diet was causing lives to be killed, right? Lives to disappear. And once he put that together, he just felt that he couldn't anymore, especially because he now lived in India, where there were so many other choices. And so when he gave this teaching, he asked us how many of us actually read this prayer or said this prayer. And it's like all the hands went up. This is the first prayer we were taught as kids, right? And then he said, well, how many of you eat meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? And then all the hands went up again. And then he kind of explained his reason for why he had gone vegetarian and whether people would consider it. Now, I am an environmental scientist, have been an activist since I was in high school. I was such a failed vegetarian until that point. I had tried several times to give up meat, but then always gone back to it. So when His Holiness said, can any of you consider becoming vegetarians? The sea of hands went up, and including mine. And so I often describe it as like an out-of-body experience, because my hand went up because I was so moved by my faith leader asking. It was a call to action as a person of faith, right? But there was this social scientist in me going, what are you doing? What is happening? What is this? This is mass behavior change, And so in many ways, for me, that was the catalyst of understanding that faith leaders were the missing piece in environmental and climate issues and movements. But also what it meant was a faith leader had challenged, a Tibetan faith leader had challenged Tibetan Himalayan people to go vegetarian. And tens of thousands of people did in that moment. My family is filled with vegetarians now because of that. All the monasteries and nunneries are vegetarian. So it's created just the action, that one sign of leadership and that call to action to the faith community has created such an important ripple effect. And, when we, in the monasteries, when we talk about vegetarianism, we always start with compassion. And then we talk about the climate change, the climate impacts of being vegetarian and how crucial that is. But the climate part doesn't lead. One of the things I've learned with faith communities is that you have to start with their values before you throw in all the scientific reasons, right? There has to be the thing that moved me. Because his call to me was not as an environmentalist, it was as a Buddhist. Are you being a good Buddhist, right? Are you living up to your vow? And that, the power of that is so incredible.
Thank you. Other questions? If we don't have some immediately, actually, Kelsang Dorjibutia is here with us. Kelsang, are you are you available? Yeah. So you mentioned, this the third highest peak, that no one hears about. You said in part because people don't climb it, so you don't have the industry around that site. Can you give us like a little more context for understanding the importance of that site, that mountain, when you were growing up, what you learned from your grandmother, your mother, and Kazanwa, feel free to also join because you talked about this. But yeah, please, I'd love to hear more.
I can say a little bit. Then Kazangla definitely should as well. It's so good to see you. So So ever since we were children, well, the way it begins for us as children is that there is a big festival every year. It's called Panglapsol. And that's the festival where we worship our deity, right? Our protective deity, Kanchenjunga. And there are all these dances and, you get good food and you get to play with all your friends. And so I think it begins that way as children, this understanding that all our elders have come together to participate in a prayer and basically a request that he continue to protect us. And so there is an uplifting of that identity that happens, right? It's not just a God that is untouchable. It's actually a God that our people are in conversation with and are in communication with. He has a very tangible presence, which is the mountain. And so I think that relationship ends up, talk about embodiment, right? The mountain is the embodiment of this protective deity. Cousin should definitely jump in because I might get this wrong. But so for our people, the Bhutia people, we originally came from Tibet. And the Lepcha people and the Limbu people already were in Sikkim. And so our understanding is that when we came together, because we didn't want to have a war, and we wanted to have a harmonious, create a kingdom, Sukhin, right, Sikkim, we actually asked Kanchenjunga to come and be the witness that we will never war amongst ourselves, and that this is a coming together. It's a brotherhood of 3 different tribal communities. And so it's only after that we created this kingdom, this Buddhist kingdom called Sikkim.
Oh, lasso. Tashtela, everyone again. Rila out there. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm just a little bit away from LA right now. Just for the AAS here in Honolulu.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Dekila, Tujishila, for bringing Kanchenjunga, which is actually the name of Kanchenjunga. Yeah, so it's the effect of colonialism again. Corrupt name of Kanchenjunga. It means the 5 repository, 5 treasures we call it. Big mountain with 5 special treasures. Yeah, so when Guru Rinpoche first came to Sikkim, he hid lots of treasures. So we have all sorts of treasures, starting from medicine, minerals, to even arms and ammunitions, and etc. So yeah, Kanchenjunga, it's very significant. It has significance both from Buddhist as well as from indigenous traditions. Yeah. Long before Guru Rinpoche came to Denjong, Sikkim, it is said that Kanchenjunga actually didn't accept. It's very interesting. There's where you can have Buddhism as well as indigenous, kind of come together. Kanchenjunga didn't accept, the deity didn't accept Guru Rinpoche that easily. Even Guru Rinpoche had to think over it. In one of the texts which I read, it says that when Guru Rinpoche came to the border, Kanchenjunga actually, he went away. He didn't come to meet him that easily. It wasn't a very warm welcome. But then after some time, it took some time where Guru Rinpoche and Kanchenjunga had a dialogue. That's how I put it. So they had a mutual dialogue, and the relationship was kind of a cordial. And hence then, Guru Rinpoche and Kanchenjunga had a dialogue, and then Kanchenjunga accepted Guru Rinpoche's wishes for him to act as the guardian of the land, the guardian of Denjong, Beyur Demojong, hidden land of the rice, or the valley of rice, or how I put it, as the valley of abundance. You have not only vegetation, but there's so much of vegetation buried in it. And therefore, for Bhutia, as well as the local community, Kanchenjunga as a deity plays a significant role. Therefore, Dekila has in the beginning presented it so well, so beautifully that actually we don't allow mountaineers to climb Kanchenjunga to the summit. Even if they make an attempt, they are not supposed to reach to the top. They are supposed to leave certain meters to the summit. They're not allowed to go right up to the summit. Yeah. So I think 1963, our 12th king, Sir Tashi Namgyal, made it very clear with the mountaineers. Yeah. And apart from that, Kanchenjunga is being celebrated in the 7th month of the Buddhist lunar calendar as Pangal Hapsol, as Dekila has put it very beautifully in the beginning. It is you can put it in many ways. It can be a celebration as a witness deity, Kanchenjunga as a witness deity. Why? Because when Buddhists came from Kham, Eastern Tibet, in the text it says from Minyak, Kham Minyak. Around 13th century, they made a pact deal with the indigenous people, with Tekong Tek and Nyukongal, and witnessing, keeping Kanchenjunga as a witness. They signed a blood brotherhood with the Lepcha indigenous and the Bhutia, keeping Kanchenjunga as witness. And the other perspective is really beautiful for environmental environmental study, is that Kanchenjunga is also known as Pangal Hapsol. Some people also say it's a celebration of the landscape itself, Pangal Hapsol, because Sikkim under Kanchenjunga has lots of deities. I think all the landscape has deities. It's just like the Japanese kami. Everywhere you look at it, there's deity. There's no place without any deities. So it itself is a celebration of the entire sacred landscape. Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. I think I'm going too much.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you. Sarah Richardson has her hand up. Okay, Sarah.
All right. My question was, My question was, I really appreciated your point, Dekila, that faith communities can be really primed for eco-activism, and that many, and especially in the Buddhist context, it makes so much sense. But I'm wondering, I also really appreciated bringing perspective to the fact that major religious institutions like the Catholic Church are, one of the world's largest landowners, and maybe aren't necessarily, as an institution, possibly as involved. And so I'm wondering what's the needed ingredient in terms of bringing faith communities along into, and like questions of scale, because there's a difference of, in the context of the Catholic Church, we're having real conversations around decolonizing and what it means to reconcile with a history of extreme violence against indigenous communities that went alongside the appropriation of land. And yeah, so I'm sorry, it's not a clear question, but I'm wondering, how do you think we can, or how are you seeing the reach out to kind of large, different faith institutions?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a great question. What I see actually right now is this incredible convergence between faith and environmental knowledge in general. And I see it in every religion. I think part of what we have here is this sort of a misperception in the academic community in particular, but also in the environmental and just general public, that faith leaders have not been active on environmental and climate change. And it's because they refuse to use the language we recognize as environmental. So it may surprise you to know that actually all three popes, including Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul II, were strong advocates for climate science. They all came out saying climate science is real, climate change is real. Pope Benedict, during his time, the Vatican put out this very gleeful press release saying that they were declaring the Vatican as the first independent state that was carbon neutral. And they did this during Pope Benedict's time, even before Pope Francis. Of course, Pope Francis is famous because he created the Laudato Si in 2015, which is his environmental encyclical. And it's revolutionary. Really, there's no other word for it. Because what he did was he actually tied environmental and climate issues with the fact that, with poverty and inequity. And of course, when you're in an academic setting, this is something that we do all the time. But out there in, let's say, what we call the real world, right? We just take it for granted that neoliberalism is the way things are. That is just the socioeconomic order of today. Even socialist countries use it, right? This idea that you're basically capitalism with no checks and balances. And he raised it and put it in front of everybody and said, how is this sustainable? You will not reach sustainability with this model, especially because this model is predicated on, resource extraction of living beings, including humans. And so he was really clear to talk about the inequity and poverty and how this model that was also devastating the environment was devastating humans, and that the model had to be questioned. And so that is why I say it was revolutionary, because there aren't many religious leaders who would go that far, right? But the thing I love about what they've done since is that they actually ended up creating a platform. So they have a Laudato Si platform. It's through this that they have really activated Catholic ministries around the world so earlier when I put up that thing about the divestment of fossil fuels, the Catholic Church leads that divestment among the faith community. They are by far the biggest divestors of fossil fuels in general. They're the largest stakeholder group. And that's largely because of the Laudato Si platform. He's also done something that I'm really happy about, because he's done these calls to interfaith communities, sort of calling faith leaders from other communities to come and join him. So I don't know how many of you were tracking the Convention of Parties recently on climate change, but before that, he hosted several events with faith leaders, and they jointly created this letter to the Convention of Parties, saying that they were standing firmly on the side of basically, right, that we need to make sure that global warming doesn't go beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. And so I think the Catholic Church is surprisingly doing a lot more than what most people realize. Loka doesn't work with them because our criteria for who we work with is underrepresentation. So basically, we work with the communities that are not already represented very well in the environmental and climate movements. But having said that, we partner quite a lot with them, and the person who is tapped to be the coordinator of the dicastery for integral development, which is all the environmental sustainable stuff, has actually been an advisor to Loka. I think on the indigenous part, I think, we're also at a moment of reckoning. And I think that's true for every institution out there, including faith institutions. My own personal experience with the Catholic Church was when I mentioned that with WWF Sacred Earth, I chose to work in 5 places. One of the places I worked in was in the Amazon. And we worked around World Youth Day, which was the first pilgrimage, which is the largest global pilgrimage in the world. It's millions of Catholic youth that come together, and the Pope speaks to them, right? But what was really fascinating about this one was it was the first time Pope Francis was coming back to Latin America as the Pope. So there was this sort of, like the son of Latin America is coming back as the Pope. So there was a lot of energy around it. There were up to, the numbers vary, but it's somewhere between 2 and 3 million youth that were gathered in Rio. And as part of WWF and as part of Sacred Earth, we had developed this partnership where we were able to create films that were really used Catholic language to talk about the importance of the Amazon. And we would show it right before he spoke and right after he spoke. So he's speaking in Copacabana Beach to millions of people, and we were able to show these videos in between. But we were really challenged, by our indigenous partners who were bringing up constantly this legacy. And so we requested that the Pope actually take on this issue. And we were able to put this in front of him. There was a coalition of us that were able to put this request in front of him. And immediately after the World Youth Day was over, he called all the bishops of Latin America and said, we have to talk about indigenous ownership and protection of indigenous lands. So I see, when I talk about the opportunities I see in the Anthropocene, this is part of what I see. What I see is that we have, just as we have terrible leaders, we have wonderful leaders. We have leaders that are tying all of these things together by themselves and saying this is unsustainable at a moral level and at an environmental level, right? And so I think, I don't know if that answers all your questions, but I think that's I would say that actually he and the Catholic Church right now represent a lot of incredible leadership on environmental and climate issues.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Francis Garrett made a really important point in the chat. Francis, do you want to actually just maybe comment as well on what you said here, if you don't mind? I think it's really important. If Francis is here.
I'm here, sorry. Thank you so much for that amazing talk. That was so incredibly articulated and really so powerful, as Rory said. And I guess I was responding partly also to what Kelsangla was talking about in terms of and what you had mentioned too, Dekila, is the kind of agency that landscape features have, and how North American settler communities in particular can learn a lot from the kind of agency that many indigenous communities have always given to landscape features like mountains or rivers or bodies of water. So that was all I was commenting on in the chat.
I think one of the things that I find myself keeping an eye on all the time is how many around the world there is this real push to give legal rights, right? With local tribes and communities basically fighting for ecological entities, let's say, to have legal rights like human beings do. I mean, if corporations can have legal rights, why not rivers, right? And so, for example, the north of us and the south of you guys, wild rice is a perfect example, right? With all the Anishinaabe tribes coming together to basically get wild rice to have legal entity and have legal rights. There are several rivers, including Colombia, New Zealand, Wanganui River, I think, that have won these battles, these legal battles. Now, we haven't figured out what that means beyond that, but the fact is that local communities could actually organize themselves to protect these entities. And I think it could be a really powerful legal way for us to protect ecosystems in particular. When I was talking about how everything is open flow in the earth, one of the big disadvantages of open flow means that it's really hard to put a boundary and say this part, right, benefits my government and my people only, and therefore I will protect it. And, the thing about ecology is like it's really unconditional love and compassion, every species and everybody gets to thrive. And so I think what's going to be fascinating is to see how we interpret legal representation of these entities. I see a lot of hope actually in this method.
Thank you. We have a question from Jade Hoy.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Since you mentioned that one of the beautiful features about Heart Sutra is non-duality, I was wondering, what do you What do you think about other possible Buddhist attitudes such as xenofeminism, being anti-naturalist, a politics of alienation, feminism that rejects natural order, essentialism theology, and goes as far as to say that we should change it if nature is unjust?
That could be just an entire talk. I have two perspectives to it. So the first perspective is very much what I would take to my prayer room, right? Which is everything. If everything is emptiness, then I as a self don't exist. And therefore, like the freedom that gives me to let go of my attachment to how I want things to be, right? So there is that first element to it, I think, which is when we talk about non-dualism, then it is also having to let go and understand that your attachment to things being the right way, things being the wrong way, right? Things being good or bad, all of those things, that's just an attachment. And you can sort of wiggle around with that attachment, and then create a space and let it go. So that's one thing. I think on a personal level, that practice can be profoundly empowering. I think it is the path to enlightenment, right? However far we may be from it. So I have to say one thing, as a Himalayan person, we would never dare to imagine we will become enlightened in this lifetime or even in the next 20 lifetimes. This is one of the big cultural shocks for me in the West, is when Westerners have this ambition, but I think the other part of your question to me really comes down to another concept that I'm really influenced by, and that is the idea of designing for access. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. So design for access, I think, was created in the architectural world, and it really was created so that architects thought about the people that needed the most access, right? Like, so people in wheelchairs, people who are who are most marginalized and never considered. And so this concept basically is that you design thinking about the most marginalized people. And it turns out that if you design a building, let's say a hospital, with a pathway for people who travel in wheelchairs, what you're actually doing is also designing a pathway for people who are lame, for people who are old, for people who might not be feeling well that day. You suddenly end up protecting a whole category of people who are not as marginalized or less privileged as that original person, right? And to me, this concept is really, really influential, because I think a lot of the time when we especially get into philosophical debates, we don't consider who it harms the most. We might consider the harm it could potentially have, but we don't actually categorize who it harms the most. And I think when you think about the work you do and the philosophies that we're trying to embody, we have to think about how that goes out into the world and who it affects. And so if we always design to protect the most marginalized in any setting, the group that has that it doesn't have a voice, right? What we end up doing is protecting everybody else. So for me, when I come across, and I should be really clear to say that I have had pushback from faith communities all along doing this work. I had a very prominent Rinpoche really, tear me to shreds, saying I was distracting with this from enlightenment, right? Like there are all kinds of pushback that I get. However, at the end of the day, what I focus on is, if we keep the status quo as it is, sorry, everybody, meet my office, make my dog rewa. So if we keep the status quo as it is, or if we allow people to have philosophies that are harmful, it might not directly affect us. It might not even affect powerful women, educated women. It might not affect, like Himalayan women who, especially from Sikkim is one of the most gender equal communities in the world. But it will affect a lot of women negatively, people who are in cultures that are not like mine. And so whatever it is we do and however we interpret philosophy, we have to think about who does it protect and who does it leave even more vulnerable. And that has to be part of the determination. which philosophy we decide to end up supporting and defending.
Thank you so much. Dekila, I have another question. Oh, actually, no, Sunjung, please.
Oh, I can go after you if you
No,
want
no, please,
to.
please. No, I've already asked.
Yeah, Dekila, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And I just wanted to, it's more of a comment that I have. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being such a wonderful person and an active person. You are putting all of us to shame who as academics think about these things, but never go out to do anything really. And so, I just wanted to kind of, give you a shout out for that. But what I had in mind is more of a conceptual thing. And some time ago, I had the good fortune to listen to a talk by James Hansen, who is one of the leading climatologists. And something that he said really struck me very, very hard, which is that anything that has to do with climate change, the problem is that us as human beings never react to something that happens so slowly. And the problem, therefore, when it comes to the people in power who can actually affect changes, such as something, such as this politicians or whatever, is that they are so, they look at the short term because that's what matters to them, right? It's the next election after 5 years or what have you, right? And so I'm just kind of thinking about the involvement that you've described of the religious communities and the interfaith communities. And I just think that it's so wonderful because this is the type of problem that needs the long-term vision, right? That cannot, we just cannot rely on, our instinctive human, as human beings, our instinctive by nature, but but it's okay, it's going to be the next generation that's going to, have to worry about this and we'll be fine. Well, I'm sure we'll deal with it. And this is just not the right approach. So I'm just kind of wondering if you had any, I don't know, more thoughts about the kind of timeline, the temporal consideration of this problem. It's a very vague kind of.
No, this is, I mean, everything you're saying resonates, right? So I feel so bad for Jim Hansen because talk about Cassandra, he was out there shouting this from the top of his lungs for 4 decades now, and most people weren't listening. And I'll be really, it's sort of like an industry secret, but when climate change first came about into the environmental movements, a lot of the scientists saw it as a threat against what they were doing with biodiversity. It was like, don't distract us, So I think I think part of the problem is that we think in silos and we function in silos, right? So it's not, there are politicians that care about climate change, but if you ask them to put their money in one basket, that probably isn't where they put their money because again, they think in silos. And for me, going back to this concept of interdependence, it's why it's been so rejuvenating for my own hope has been because it allows us to have this debate that kind of cuts through all of that, this idea that we exist in separate entities, right? I think in terms of time, so we're at this point where we've run out. I often, people ask me about hope and they really want to know if we can stay within two degrees, right? And we're like this close to the edge of global warming staying within 2 degrees. We're past the point of 1.5 degrees. So which means that 1/3 of humanity is going to be in really dire straits very soon, right? So I think the other point that is really interesting to me is, there's been this real uptick in eco-anxiety and climate distress, and it's everywhere in the news. People are talking about it all the time. And it's partly, we have to call out the West, the global North centricism that exists in media and exists all over the world, because poorer countries in the global south have been impacted by climate change for several decades, right? We have countries that are literally now underwater and are climate refugees looking to, Kiribati, for example, they are completely going to be landless, right? It's been happening all this time. It's just that no one was paying attention. And by no one, I mean the global north. And so I think in a weird way, being at this point in time is more energizing than having been at this point in time in 2000, where I couldn't get anyone to care in the West, right? Right now, people are agitated. And so there is this power to that where you can actually take people's anxieties and translate it into action. You can't take indifference and translate it into action, And so for the last 3 decades, people were indifferent. And all of a sudden they woke up and went, oh, firenado, that's such a funny term. Tornadoes with fire. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's happening every season. We have firenadoes. When it started, we thought that was a funny thing. And there were all these jokes about sharknadoes. And now for 3 seasons straight, 5 seasons straight, we've had firenadoes, right? And so something changes in our mind when that threat suddenly becomes imminent. And it starts to affect the people we're with and the communities we care about. And we are unfortunately at that point. So I actually think that the great win around that is that we no longer have that space to say we're not going to care about it. I mean, even Republican senators are being called by their communities, right, to care about, wildfires in Texas, right? The drought that everyone's ignoring that's happening in the Southwest. This is the unprecedented drought that we've been in for several years, actually, right? The Atlantic storms, and you can just keep talking, you can name them all. All of a sudden, people are tying it to fossil fuels, to tar sands, right? And I think one of the things that I try very hard in Loka's outreach, and I encourage everybody to do, is to recognize that Indigenous people have been right all along. We have a tendency to look at the protests that are led by, for example, like Standing Rock or, Line 6 or any of these protests that you can think of as a Native American protest. And actually, that's a fossil fuel protest. That's a climate change protest. But our media doesn't cover it that way. And if anything, that's where the fight is. That's where the environmental and climate movement and people who are concerned need to be right now. That's really where the energy needs to be. And so I think for better or for worse, we're in this point where action has to happen. Because I think the more the pressures come at home, the more people are going to react. And this is where the money is, and this is where the power is, right? So it's been interesting also for me to see what's happening in Ukraine, because now the conversation really is around fossil fuel dependence with Russia, right? And so with the US putting pressure on EU to kind of divest from that. So we're at a point where I think many silos are sort of breaking apart and things are kind of starting to overlap. And I think we have to keep just talking about it and raising our concerns at every level that we can.
Thank you. I hope you're right.
Dekila, thank you so much. We are coming to the end of our time. If there are any other questions, then please, you can raise your hand. But I mean, I just want to say that it's hard to listen to this and not feel emotional, and like what you're doing is just so important. It's really the most important thing, and I'm just so grateful for everything you're doing. But yeah, thank you so much. You're just such an eloquent speaker, and you have so much insight. Okay, so I think I'm going to transition to our outro now. So yeah, first of all, thank you again, Dekila. Just on behalf of the host center and also the Religion and Public Sphere Initiative at the Department for Study of Religion, and everyone who came today, who's watching, just thank you for joining us. And thanks also to the team that has made this possible. So first to Caleb Owens, our work study student, and Sungjung Kim, our new director, and to Francis Garrett, who has co-organized the series with me, to Betsy Moss, who is the coordinator of the host center, and finally to Sarah Richardson, who's our producer. As I said, this is made possible through the host center and also through Religion in the Public Sphere. So we're grateful for their support. And then finally, I'm happy that we don't have to kind of end for the year because there's so much more that we could say, and this is very inspiring and just so important, as I said. So we are going to have a roundtable discussion. This is on May 19th. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger for everyone so it's also the details. May 19th at 3 p.m. So we're going to have Jeff Barstow, Kasang Bhutia, Jana Kyatso, Dekila, and Henry Shu. Leah Stokes just had twins, baby girls, so she's a little occupied with that at the moment. So she, sadly had to decline, but was grateful for her for the chance to join us and share her work with us earlier in the year. But we will get a chance to come back together and talk more. So we have that to look forward to. And yeah, I'll bring some good questions for us to think over. And I think we'll end with that. So Dekila, thank you so much. Really, it's such a wonderful event, and I really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for coming.